Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. We're seeing major changes in the Democratic primary field right before the biggest delegate day of the race. Joe Biden won big in South Carolina. The former vice president pulled in nearly half of the total vote, finishing about 30 percentage points ahead of Bernie Sanders. That netted him 39 delegates compared to Sanders' 14. A series of exits from the primary field followed. First was billionaire Tom Steyer. He suspended his bid Saturday night without earning a single delegate. He spent nearly $200 million on his campaign and ultimately finished third in South Carolina. But Steyer's campaign wasn't the only casualty of the weekend. On Sunday, Pete Buttigieg ended his campaign. The former South Bend, Indiana mayor started off relatively unknown. He had a slim victory in Iowa and a second-place finish in New Hampshire. However, Buttigieg wasn't able to expand his success after that. On Monday, Senator Amy Klobuchar also dropped out. She suspended her campaign just a day before her home state of Minnesota's primary. Both Buttigieg and Klobuchar endorsed Joe Biden Monday, along with another ex-candidate, former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke. Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Zach Montellaro join me now to break down the impact of these changes. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. And Zach covers campaigns for Politico. It's good to see you all. Ed, let me begin with you. We know that Buttigieg and Klobuchar are throwing their support behind Joe Biden, but do we know where their supporters could actually go tomorrow?
That's a good question, Elaine. We don't have updated figures, but when CBS News most recently asked it in a battleground tracker poll in January, Buttigieg supporters were actually inclined to support Senator Sanders. And in the case of Senator Klobuchar, they were inclined to support either Vice President Biden. Sorry, did I say Senator Sanders? I meant Senator Warren. Forgive me. Yes. They were inclined to support Senator Warren next, followed by former Vice President Biden. In the case of Klobuchar, it was their second choice was former Vice President Biden and then Senator Warren. So you can see there a little bit of a difference. Klobuchar voters perhaps looking first for an ideological alternative and then a gender alternative. Buttigieg supporters clearly looking for something else entirely. And it was part of the reason why Warren got boxed out in Iowa, because Buttigieg did so well among voters that were of interest to both of them and that were interested in both of them. So, we'll see. Obviously, they tonight will try to forcefully encourage their supporters to back the former vice president and blunt the momentum of Senator Sanders. We'll see if it works.
Well, Ed, we know that more than 1 million Democrats have cast early ballots in each of the two largest Super Tuesday states, Texas and California. What happens to voters there and in the other 14 states who have already cast a ballot for a candidate no longer in the race?
They will still be counted as such, but yeah, they don't get to do it over. And there is a potential that in one of these states, Buttigieg or Klobuchar could potentially even reach viability thanks to early vote totals and maybe even some votes cast tomorrow, and still potentially accrue delegates. It would be legal under the rules of the party. Isn't necessarily expected at this point, but could happen. So they may not have dropped out fast enough.
Caitlin, let me turn to you. Senator Elizabeth Warren was sitting right between Buttigieg and Klobuchar in the count of delegates to date. What do we know about her plans for her campaign?
Well, with Amy Klobuchar now out of the race, all eyes are on Elizabeth Warren, who actually placed behind Pete Buttigieg in South Carolina on Saturday. Elizabeth Warren just received a big endorsement from Emily's List, a sign that her campaign figures to continue on. But tomorrow, her home state of Massachusetts is holding a Super Tuesday contest, and she is well behind Bernie Sanders there, according to recent polls. Bernie Sanders went to Massachusetts a couple of days ago to campaign, drawing a very large crowd. I've asked Elizabeth Warren if she could guarantee that she would win her home state, and she wouldn't answer. But it would be difficult to see her continuing on if she isn't able to even win her home state. It's interesting also to consider where Elizabeth Warren's support is coming from. We like to talk about polls, and we like to also note that lots of times voters don't particularly fall into the lanes that we cast them in. I talked to a lot of supporters of Elizabeth Warren who also liked Amy Klobuchar because they wanted a woman candidate. I've talked to supporters of Elizabeth Warren who also like Pete Buttigieg because they wanted someone new. So we're kind of waiting to see what the impact is. If Elizabeth Warren, who shares a lot of policy ideas with Bernie Sanders, whether she is trying to stop his momentum in some of these states. She has a large operation on the ground. She's competing in Texas here and in California as well. And so we'll see if she can make the case to continue. I would note, however, that her campaign in a memo just a couple of days ago said that they don't think anyone in this race is going to get the necessary delegates needed to clinch the nomination outright, and that this could be headed towards a contested convention.
Interesting. Well, Zach, Joe Biden has picked up at least 15 endorsements since Saturday, including Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and the two most recent former DNC chairs. So is that evidence that the Democratic establishment is finally coalescing around a candidate?
Yeah, I think this is probably the clearest sign that most, establishment, moderate Democrats, whatever word you want to use, are backing Joe Biden. The only person in his lane, quote unquote, right now is Mike Bloomberg. Mike Bloomberg hasn't been on any contest so far. He kind of has flopped on the debate stage, but Mike Bloomberg has about $500 million worth of television ads backing him up. That's what I'm watching for on Super Tuesday, is where does Bloomberg come in, and does Bloomberg ever stop Biden from reaching the viability threshold? It looks like Senator Sanders will hit that threshold in just about everywhere. Biden will be close second, but there could be some parts that Bloomberg does hit that threshold and Biden doesn't. That's what I'm watching. Does Bloomberg win some otherwise delegates that would be going towards Biden, and could that really push this race out to extend?
And Zach, just to follow up, as we look at that list of endorsements and you look at where they are coming from and the specific states represented there, how powerful do you think those endorsements will be in perhaps helping people to make up their minds? You see Virginia, for instance, a critical state, Arizona. Are these kinds of endorsements, you think, going to provide a boost for the vice president? I suppose we'll find out tomorrow.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out tomorrow. It feels like the entire state of Virginia, at least the elected officials there, have jumped behind Biden. I've been a little hesitant to see where endorsements go this cycle, though. People like Kamala Harris, people like Cory Booker had, a decent level of endorsements, and they got basically nowhere in the polls. And compare that to Senator Sanders, who has almost no congressional backing. I think he has like 7 members of Congress that have backed him. It's not a lot, but Sanders is the one at the front of the polls. So, these signals are more of a signal towards those really, really tuned-in voters. And if a race is going to be close, you want every vote that you can get, certainly. But as goes Congress may not be as goes the Democratic electorate at this point. Something
we'll be watching closely. Well, Ed, I want to show the reaction to former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid's endorsement of Joe Biden from Sanders' campaign manager, Faz Shakir. He wrote, quote, "Disappointing. I'll forever have respect and love for Senator Reid, but I'm old enough to remember when he thought Biden's ideas were worthy of being put in a fireplace." So, Ed, why is this endorsement personal for Shakir and many on Sanders' staff?
He used to work for Harry Reid, and he knows that Harry Reid has encouraged all of his former Senate colleagues who are running to keep running. And so the fact that he's now endorsing is essentially, a gut punch to someone like Shakir, who worked for him. Would be for several people who are working for people like Elizabeth Warren as well, because they worked for Harry Reid once. That is a choice anecdote to recall.
Fireplace,
throwing things in the fireplace. That's from the fiscal cliff negotiations and some of the shutdown negotiations. I'm struggling to recall which one specifically, but there was a moment where Vice President Biden and Mitch McConnell had tried to put together a potential path forward, and they literally dropped it into the fireplace of Harry Reid's office. That's what they thought of it. Sent them all back to the drawing board. That's an incredible anecdote to recall. And
there's no mincing words on that.
Clearly designed to get under Biden's skin.
Right. Absolutely. Caitlin, let me ask you, one person who has yet to back a candidate is former President Barack Obama. And in your interview, you asked Joe Biden about why his former boss is staying quiet. Let's listen to that response.
You have had a conversation with former President Obama. I understand that you talked after the South Carolina victory of yours. Why hasn't he endorsed you?
Because I asked him not to in the very beginning. People didn't believe it. In the very beginning, when I announced, I said I specifically asked him not to because, look, the argument I knew was going to be Biden feels like he's entitled. He's the vice president. You saw everybody in that stage from the first debate on said he's acting entitled. He's the vice president, thinks he is owed this. And if the president had endorsed me, I think it would have just been all about whether or not he endorsed me and was that the reason why I was running. And I really believe it's important that I demonstrate that I earned this on my own. He's a great personal friend. He remains my friend. And I'm confident if I'm the nominee, he'll be of enormous help. But I've asked him not to get engaged.
Fascinating conversation, Caitlin, with the former vice president. So how much impact would an intervention from former President Obama have on this Democratic contest?
Right, well, I also asked Biden if he felt Obama needed to step in order to kind of unite the party, especially as Democrats are trying to narrow this down into a one-on-one race between a person like Biden and Bernie Sanders as he continues to gain momentum and as he's poised to do well in a couple of Super Tuesday states, namely California, tomorrow. Obama is the most popular figure in Democratic politics right now. And if you don't believe me, look at the ads that many of these candidates have been running. All of them pretty much feature Obama in them. Everyone from Michael Bloomberg to Elizabeth Warren. But that kind of void has allowed these candidates to kind of claim a part of Obama's legacy. Joe Biden talks a lot about Obama on the campaign trail as he's tried to narrow this race down between himself and Bernie Sanders. He's kind of gone after Sanders for not being a real Democrat. Sanders is still a registered independent, and he calls himself, Biden does, an Obama-Biden Democrat. That's a line that we've been hearing on the campaign trail a lot. And it's significant because we heard it a lot in South Carolina. Here in Texas, I attended an event in Houston that Joe Biden had. He talked about that as well, focusing on areas where African-American voters are key, like here in Houston and in South Carolina and in North Carolina, which votes tomorrow, these Super Tuesday states and beyond. This is a constituency that Biden has a deep connection with, but he also relies heavily on his connection with Obama. That's why people feel like they know him. It's a big part of his stump speech. So the idea that Obama hasn't endorsed him yet, you kind of heard him say he didn't want it to look like a coronation, and there's some truth to that, I think, especially after 2016, that he wants to earn this on his own. But I am waiting to see like when that point comes that Obama needs to step in if this gets to a point where this is a protracted fight.
Right. So many people interested to hear when the former president will weigh in. Well, Zach, let's take a step back and look at the delegate math going forward. More than 1/3 of all total delegates are up for grabs tomorrow. By March 17th, more than half will be given out. So walk us through the impact these next few weeks could have.
Yeah, so far, about 4% of delegates have been awarded in the first 4 states. So if somebody says we're not that far into the race, they're telling the truth. You know, to win the nomination, candidates need 1,991 delegates on the first ballot. And that's what everyone's fighting for right now. It's winning these delegates in these states by winning the vote, you know, usually the popular vote unless you're a caucus state. And, you know, come tomorrow, basically, once all the results from tomorrow are calculated, and that could be a little bit because of California. California will take a while. But we'll have a good idea after tomorrow on if we're headed to a contested convention or not. If there's only really 2 candidates winning the majority of these delegates, you know, say Sanders and Biden, it looks like we can avoid a contested convention. If people like Elizabeth Warren and people like Mike Bloomberg, who are still in the race, pick up a significant amount of delegates, then we could be headed towards a contested convention. You know, we'll know by the end of March, basically, once the majority of the delegates have been awarded, which way we're going to go. But it really comes down to tomorrow. The first 4 states winnow the field. They don't really have that much effect on the actual math behind the nominating process. Tomorrow is the first day and the biggest day of the calendar.
And Ed, let's talk about money here. What do we know about where the remaining candidates stand financially?
Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have a huge money lead over Joe Biden, but of course they're all dwarfed by Michael Bloomberg, who continues to spend hand over fist over hand on this race, having spent at least about $500 million so far across the country, not only in advertising, but in staffing, travel, and whatnot. This is now the first presidential campaign to top $1 billion in spending this early in an election season. It just speaks to the tremendous reach and size of this campaign, of the field, and the need to reach voters not only on television, but in the digital space, platforms like this one, and just through Facebook, Twitter, or whatever else. So Biden has raised about $10 million in the hours after South Carolina into Sunday. Great haul for him. Most he's raised over that period, more than he's raised in some months over the course of this campaign. But Sanders raised like $40 million plus last month. Bloomberg can spend $10 million before breakfast, and it's just going to be a real struggle for him and something he's going to have to worry much more about in the coming days if he wants to remain viable and competitive going into states where, Florida, for example, Illinois, bigger places, more expensive media markets, a little larger that requires some more extensive travel.
Right. Well, Caitlin, you are coming to us from Houston right now. Texas is a state Democrats have been looking to win back for years now. They came close with Beto O'Rourke in 2018, but still lost. Who is the party looking to energize in that state ahead of the general election?
Well, they're looking at places like Houston, where the demographics are growing in favor of Democrats. About a quarter of voters here, or residents here, are African American, and about 45% are Hispanic. This is the kind of area that Democrats feel like they can grow. They had record turnout in 2018 in Houston, elected a number of women, especially women of color, are a huge driving force in areas like this one. Just a couple of months ago, Democrats held a debate here at a historically black university. That's also where Joe Biden was today, giving a rally ahead of the primary tomorrow night. So Democrats are really focused on organizing in Texas, and having it go earlier in the calendar, I think, speaks to that. There will be no candidates in Texas tomorrow. They'll be fanned out across the other Super Tuesday states, but we are here. We're going to be watching polling locations as well to see if turnout can match. Remember, people have already been voting, and they are hoping to have a record turnout here to not only show an expansive constituency in the primary and show some energy, but also show what they may be able to do in the general election.
Well, Zach, obviously it is too early to say whether we're headed for a contested convention, but walk us through how that process would actually work.
So the way we get to a contested convention is no candidate gets a majority of pledged delegates on the first ballot. 1991, that's the magic number for the first ballot. If that doesn't happen, in the second and subsequent ballots, it's basically a free-for-all. Probably the biggest change is that superdelegates would be allowed to vote in the second ballot. If you remember from 2016, superdelegates are party officials, members of Congress, distinguished party leaders, which means former presidents, former Senate leaders, former party chairs, who can vote basically irregardless of how their state votes. If you're a superdelegate, you can choose to back whoever you want to back and vote how you want. A major thing that happened after the 2016 election was a unity commission between Hillary Clinton supporters, Bernie Sanders supporters, and neutral officials in the DNC. And they kind of scaled back the power of superdelegates. Superdelegates can't vote on the first ballot anymore. But if we get to a second ballot in a contested convention when nobody has the majority of pledged ballots, or delegates rather, that's when those superdelegates can vote. And that kind of throws everything into disarray almost.
Right, and I imagine a lot of strategists are frantically trying to imagine how they would approach that if it in fact gets to that point. All right, Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Zach Montellaro, thank you all very much.